floor is yours.
Perfect. Thank you so much for the introduction and for having me here. I'm super excited to present my new book, which summarizes basically the last 10 years of my research. Conveniently, it just came out a couple of days ago. I'm specifically excited right now to be here in Poland because it's such an increasingly important migrant destination. And so I'm actually here also to learn from you guys how some of my findings can potentially apply or not apply in Poland too. So let's get into it. So how do we make immigration popular? There is no shortage of reasons why we might care about what other people think about immigration. So, elections, right? So back in my country, here we see President Donald Trump in his second term issuing a myriad of executive orders against immigration with no end in sight, clearly thinking that he has some kind of public mandate to do this. I mean, closer here to home in Europe, right? So The Economist recently declared, actually with the most recent elections in Germany and the repeated rise of the AfD party, is that the so-called hard right or far-right parties are basically the most popular party family in Europe since World War II. So obviously, there are a lot of explanations of these trends. I'm pretty sure that some folks here have probably contributed to that as well. But I think it's important not to lose sight of a very simple fact that the reason why people vote for anti-immigration parties is because they dislike immigration, right? As simple as that, or at least the way how governments are handling immigration right now in their countries. So what I would like to do in my book, at least the way I set it up, is to take a step back from this a little bit and kind of figure out how we got here in the first place. So in this sense, before President Trump as a candidate went up the escalator in 2015, before Brexit, before the rise of AfD and other far-right parties in Europe, it's important to kind of understand that most countries, including Poland, is, according to my understanding, is that they significantly restricted immigration, right? So that most people around the world, despite their motivations or aspirations, they cannot really easily migrate through some kind of legal channels, right? And it's interesting because we also have this increasing academic consensus among economists and other social scientists that relaxing at least some of those restrictions can be a really significant win-win-win for the receiving countries, for sending countries, and obviously the immigrants themselves, right? We're not talking about open borders here, right? We're talking about those marginal relaxation and like new pathways, like, just increasing the quota for H-1B visas in the US or something like that. Still, if we look at any kind of public opinion data from pretty much any country right now, we know that voters are largely skeptical of any of those relaxations. And politicians, even those who are themselves somewhat cosmopolitan, reasonably consider some of those major reforms infeasible due to fear of public backlash. As Pavel mentioned, I'm a scholar of public opinion, but I should acknowledge that not everything is determined by public opinion. Immigration policy is not even supposed to be only determined by public opinion, right? But without some allusion to kind of skeptical opinion on immigration around the world, it's really hard to understand why we have so many anti-immigration parties right now, but not a single pro-immigration party, right? So we have Green parties, obviously, who are more pro-immigration than other parties, but that's not their main thing. And so let's get into some details and the numbers. So here, I'm pretty sure some of you have seen this famous Gallup chart before that, according to my knowledge, is the longest available kind of historical data on what people think about immigration in the US. So the question was whether people want to increase or decrease immigration in the country going back to 1965. So there are a few things we can see here. The first thing is that the support for increasing immigration levels, the bottom green line that we see here, it has never been very, very high. All right, another thing that we can see here is that it's kind of going up slowly. It reached its peak actually in April 2020 in the aftermath of global pandemic, to the surprise of many people, so that for the first time in US history, more people said they wanted to increase rather than decrease immigration. And it's interesting because when I first started presenting some parts of this book a couple of years ago, some folks were like, Alex, so why bother making immigration popular? If you look at this chart, it's sort of going up by itself, right? People sort of imagine that would be like similar to gay marriage or something. Well, so fast forward a couple of years later, Now we see that situation is pretty much reversed. So I wrote a few popular articles about some of those trends. I think some of it can be explained by this kind of knee-jerk thermostatic reaction to Trump and then against Biden and then Trump again. But what I just want to highlight for now is that what we see from this chart is that the support for immigration can never be taken for granted. It's easier to lose trust on immigration for voters than to gain it. So what I'm trying to figure out in my book in terms of the main research question is to figure out how those freer, or what I call more open immigration policies can not just gain, but actually maintain durable public support among voters. Just getting a little bit into the weeds now, we're mostly talking about those immigrant receiving OECD countries in my book, which means, we have a lot of demand for immigration and significant restrictions, which implies that, if people support more open policies and the government are implementing them, it would, significantly increase immigration flows, and I conservatively set them at 1% over the total population per year in terms of immigration flows. Just to give you a sense, that's something that we regularly see in Canada, in Australia, maybe Switzerland, a few other countries, but not really like in the US, the UK, or Germany for that matter, until recently. So what I'm trying to get at my book is not just understand why people oppose immigration, but under what conditions, if any, they would actually support it, despite their racial biases that we know that people have and we know are very, very hard to change. It's not just a philosophical argument. The book is unabashedly empirical. And my hope is that even if you disagree with some of my policy conclusions in the very end, you can still, accept and learn from some of the data that I amassed over the past 10 years or so. So, immigration, we probably all know here, it's a very difficult problem to study and attack, right? It's just because, no one is randomizing any policies. A lot of those policies are determined at the federal government level, right? And so here I'm basically using every possible kind of existing public opinion data, some original survey experiments, natural experiments, and also even some qualitative comparison that I've never done before. And so the good news, to keep it short, is that I showed actually, despite their current skepticism of immigration in general, a lot of people actually are willing to support more open policies. The tricky thing is that they would only do it when they truly believe that those policies are good for their country. It's easier said than done. Why would people ever believe that immigration is good for their country? Currently, most people don't. Right? So in this sense, I have to acknowledge that the subtitle of the book, How Democracies Can Make Immigration Popular, it's a little bit more of a lure. I don't think it's easy or possible entirely to do it simply by changing how we talk about immigration. Right? Simply telling people yet again that existing immigration policy is actually good for them, they just didn't know about that, it's not going to cut it. We tried that many times in many contexts and it didn't work. I think what can happen instead is when governments in power that have some resolve, when they implement better, what I call demonstrably beneficial policies that most voters can see why they're good for them and their countries without being told. And importantly, this would include people who are more conservative and people who are less educated. The trick here is to figure out the policies that are actually going to be understandable intuitively to people in terms of their explicit intent and being straightforward of the actual design. And so when voters start seeing their governments managing immigration in their interest, the support can actually widen. And this would include people who are more vulnerable in seeking prosecution. So this is something I'm going to get back in this presentation over and over again. But I want to highlight for now that it's not just a matter of accepting some migrants over others. It's a matter of ensuring that the system as a whole is popular enough so that everyone can benefit. So just in terms of the structure of the book, it's divided into 8 chapters and 2 parts. In the first part, which I hope some folks can use as sort of like a textbook supplement of sorts for their courses, I basically review and take stock of the last 20 to 30 years of public opinion literature on immigration, and also come up with my kind of regional account of what I call voters as altruistic nationalists, which argues that people are willing to help others, even at a personal cost, but they primarily form their policy preferences based on whether those policies benefit their countries. And in the second part, I'm trying to figure out the practical implications of this evidence for policymaking and persuasion efforts. And what I argue there is that simply changing how we talk about immigration and coming up with better messaging is not going to be enough. You have to persuade people by better policy design. And obviously, since we have limited time now, I'm going to focus on some of the key chapters and parts of my evidence in the book. But I'm happy to talk about a broader argument and evidence in chapters in the Q&A as well. So the starting kind of stylized fact for a lot of my research in the book is that a lot of the widespread opposition that we see right now against immigration is not categorical, it's conditional. Meaning, so basically from survey to survey, I see that it's only 10 to 20% of the public opposed to all kinds of immigration no matter what, especially if those immigrants come from kind of ethnically different countries with different religion. But I should also say that we also see that usually 10 to 20% of people categorically support all kinds of immigration unconditionally, right? So that would be either for humanitarian or libertarian reasons, if you believe in freedom of movement no matter what. But what it also means that the vast majority of folks are actually, conditional. They have a conditional opposition to immigration, meaning that their support or opposition really depends on the nuances and the details of policies on the ground, and their stance can basically be changed depending on the details, right, beyond prejudice. So what are those details that condition people's support or opposition of immigration? So the biggest thing that I'm pretty sure a lot of people have encountered in their own research is a matter of skills, right? We see over and over again from survey to survey, from country to country, is that the vast majority of voters usually support so-called skilled immigration. It's interesting that it really doesn't matter how you frame the questions, how you post the wording or whatnot. It's really hard to kind of change this underlying support, right? Even if you zoom into particular groups of voters, particular countries, particular years, if you compare skilled immigration to lower skilled immigration or something else, if you define skills in a particular way, it's very, very broad. And so some of my colleagues take it as a sign that the thing that determines people's attitudes toward immigration is so-called sociotropic concerns, meaning that people form their preferences based on what they think is good for their country, not themselves personally. I believe this is true, but some of my colleagues disagree. We have some lively debates in the literature as usual, right? So some people would argue that people are just saying that they want immigration that's good for their country. It's a socially desirable thing to say, but what they really mean is that they just don't want to see people who look different from them or compete with them on the job market. I'm not saying it doesn't exist, right? But what I'm saying, it's probably not something that explains all of it. But I think for our kind of broader efforts, it's also unclear what the support for skilled immigration means for other types of immigration. So that's kind of what I'm trying to figure out in my book. So can we actually move this support beyond just the best and the brightest? And the good news is that we can. So what I do a lot in the first part of the book, I establish the fact that most people are in fact what can be called altruistic nationalists. And so they would oppose immigration if they perceive it's bad for their country and support it if they think it's good. So obviously, just showing that nationalists oppose immigration is not very interesting. So what I also show is that under certain conditions, those people who are more nationalist, as I reveal or measure in certain kind of survey experiments, they can actually be more supportive of immigration. Another thing that I established, which I think a lot of us realize, but we often forget, is that so-called humanitarian or cosmopolitan motivations, if you will, they are real and they exist, but they're very, very rare. Right? They might be prevalent in the audience like that among academics or kind of pro-immigration advocates, but if you zoom into like a general population, it's never going to be about 10%, which means that it's really hard to build sustainable support for immigration based on those humanitarian motivations itself in terms of political coalition building. So let me just get a little bit into the weeds of some of the evidence in the first part of the book and tell you a bit how I reveal those kind of motivations that people have when they form their immigration and other preferences. So as a part of my surveys that I've run, both in the UK and the US, with very, very similar results, I included this kind of a version of so-called dictator game, which is very common in behavioral economics, where people basically have a chance to get a real sum of money, like a price for their participation, or share this sum of money with some other participants or whatnot. The kind of nuance here was that in my case, people had to explicitly decide whether to benefit or help domestic charities or global charities of their choice. And so the charities were matched. So for instance, people could either say that they want to keep $100, or they could donate it to the domestic Red Cross, or they could donate it to the international Red Cross. And so what we see from the results is that the majority of people decided to keep the money in line with kind of other dictator games that we've seen around the world. But a huge chunk of folks decided to donate money to various charities, and the vast majority among those decided to donate domestically. I should say that this number, 13%, actually includes people who split the money equally between domestic and global charities. So the real percentage is actually much, much lower. So obviously there can be different ways to analyze this data. Just for the sake of simplicity right now, we can just kind of imagine and divide everyone into 3 buckets: people who are more selfish, who decided to keep the money, people who are more altruistically nationalist, and people who are altruistically cosmopolitan. So just to show you that this is something that is really important and predictive of people's kind of attitudes beyond immigration. So here you can see how the support for redistribution policies and social welfare policies varies by those groupings, and also how political participation differs too. And again, in line with kind of all existing research on so-called social preferences or kind of altruistic motivations, we see that people who decided to donate money in this kind of charity raffle, they are much more likely to vote and participate in politics, including kind of protesting or contacting their representatives. And they're also much more likely to support redistribution policies, including for domestic minorities in their country. And importantly, it doesn't really matter whether people donated to global or national charities. It seems like it's pretty similar, and this kind of result holds even if you control for all possible kind of social demographic covariates in a regression. But so when we move on to immigration attitudes, we see that this situation is vastly different. So at least here in the post-Brexit context in the UK, we see that only people who donated money to global charities are somewhat more pro-immigration. So that was a question about supporting more open immigration in general, kind of similar to the Gallup question we saw earlier. And then, among other groups, the support is very, very low. But we see if they ask the same exact individuals in the survey whether they would support alternative policies, increasing immigration, but also those that are explicitly designed to benefit their country through either greater taxation or selection of immigrants, we see that the support basically skyrockets across all possible groups. And what's important to me especially is that those people who were altruistically nationalist, who were either more opposed or equally opposed to immigration as other groups, suddenly, relatively speaking, they're actually now more pro-immigration in those alternative survey items. So what does it all mean? So it's interesting. So when I first published some of the findings as a part of kind of an academic journal article in comparative political studies, I noticed that everyone interpreted this in terms of policy communication. Right? So if it's true and if you believe my data that people care about national interests, maybe what it means is that we should all talk about immigration in terms of national interests, both as a governments, both as kind of pro-immigration advocates, and so on and so forth. So I don't think that this interpretation is wrong, but I certainly now think that it's incomplete. Because that's something that we've already been doing a lot. With some exceptions, actually, all governments usually frame immigration in terms of national interest already. But we also know from some of my other research about the stability of immigration attitudes that it's really, really hard to change people's minds simply by kind of framing immigration in a certain way or providing information about it. Yet we see a lot of variation in terms of attitudes, as we just saw across years in certain countries, like in Gallup, and we also see a lot of variation across countries itself. So where does this variation come from? I think it comes from the actual reality on the ground and their initial policy design that people may more or less perceive in a better way, right? So we already saw that people are rarely driven by humanitarian interests, right? And so they also have to get a sense actually what policies exist. And we also know that it's just not about immigration, right? In general, people are not very informed about politics, right? People have better things to do in their lives, so it's really hard to expect them to actually know the details of various kind of policy proposals that are discussed in like the parliament or something like that. So in this sense, I really want to highlight that what I think is important is that people should be able, and not just being told that immigration is good for them, but actually be able to see and understand those benefits by themselves. And so what I'm doing in the book, which I think is actually the most convincing part for me, is this qualitative comparison tracing the history of public opinion and policy design in Canada and Sweden, which from my perspective are basically the most opposite cases of designing immigration system in terms of national interest or humanitarian benefits, right? So Canada, we have this very transparent system going back to the 60s, which is based on their famous point-based program, where most people can actually see how immigrants are selected. And in Sweden, we have the opposite case where until very, very recently, basically the stated goal of immigration policy was to provide asylum to vulnerable populations. And in this sense, we see that even though in every single country right now we have populist politicians who are willing to demonize migrants for their electoral gain, what I basically show that it's much easier to do it in Sweden than in Canada, right? Not because Canadians are more tolerant, not because they came up with some kind of perfect messaging that convinces people, just because of the differences, underlying differences in their immigration system and the immigrant populations. And so in this sense, while we see the evidence of so-called anti-immigration backlash, what I document in my book is that it's not about immigrants per se or the number of immigrants. It's about what I call mismanaged immigration, right? In the US case, we can all think about this kind of border chaos, right? But it's not just about the border. It's also about how migration is managed and selected at the federal level. And I should also highlight it's not just about being tough on immigration. Actually, a lot of policies that are anti-immigrant in nature, as we see right now with the second Trump administration, they're also not popular because they might be perceived as chaotic and mismanaged, right? So if you just mindlessly deport random student holders or tourists at the border, that's not something that even conservative people perceive as in their national interest, right? So it's not just about being pro-immigration or anti-immigration, it's about policies being aligned with basic people's values, which includes this kind of perception of national interest, but also kind of goes beyond that in terms of what people actually value in their lives. So in this sense, one kind of key idea that I'm trying to propagate in my book is this idea that, we know that some policies are just better than others in terms of kind of public policy, right? If we do like a randomized control trial, the outcomes are going to be better in the experimental group than the control group. But what I want to highlight is that some policies are also more demonstrably better than others, right? That it's easier for people to actually understand those benefits, right? And so I define those demonstrably beneficial policies as policies that are explicitly beneficial in terms of their stated goals to receiving countries, and also policies that can be intuitively understood by a broad section of voters. And so when it comes to immigration, basically means accepting people who are wanted and needed in their communities by receiving countries, churches, businesses, and so on and so forth. It's about immigration that is economically beneficial, that can be integrated culturally, and that is well managed. And the most important thing here, I think, is that even though, as I mentioned, the skilled immigration policies that attract those kind of educated professionals is the most prototypically clear, demonstrably beneficial policies that most people understand and accept, it goes way beyond accepting the best and the brightest, right? So one kind of example that I really like to highlight is the idea of immigration of immediate relatives, right? We have very little public opinion research on whether people oppose or support immigration of foreign spouses. But in fact, even if you talk to like the staunchest Trump supporter, they would acknowledge that, of course, Americans have their full right to invite their foreign spouses. In fact, Trump famously did it himself a couple of times, right? But if people learn that actually it's very convoluted still in terms of the policy status quo, it takes several years right now in the US, and it costs thousands of dollars of fees, not to mention possible legal fees, right? A lot of people actually think it's unfair, right? Including those who are currently skeptical of immigration in general and conservative. It can also be about actually select refugee pathways. So here my favorite example is those refugee private sponsorship programs. That again, not coincidentally, is something that Canadians came up with, not the Swedes, right? Where people are basically willing to cover for someone vulnerable from abroad and invite them and sort of like ensure that they're going to be integrated and successful, right? Unfortunately, right now, we have a lot of people who are willing to actually accept others in their own homes, but a lot of governments are basically prohibiting that from happening, right? Just to give you an example of the most demonstrably harmful policy, like kind of the opposite of what I'm talking about, is probably would be accepting asylum seekers and not allowing them to work, which is still happening in many countries, right? Which basically fuels those perceptions of immigrants not contributing by, again, policy design. So one thing that I did, which I thought was interesting, so I was thinking about potential kind of empirically validated indicators that can show us whether people can see how their immigration policy is done without having any kind of specific knowledge about immigration policy. So I looked at the available OECD data on like, how many migrants are employed, how many migrants are educated, and how kind of generally selective the system is. And I came up with this demonstrably beneficial immigration index, where again, we have Canada on one end of the spectrum and then Sweden on the other end. And basically what we see, and then on the y-axis here, I have those kind of survey data based on whether people think that immigration is good for their country or not, right? And what we see is that the correlation is very, very strong. Depending on the indicator, it basically goes until 0.95. Surely, I mean, this is just a cross-sectional correlation in a handful of countries, right? So I don't want to claim any kind of causal relationship here, but I think what's really important here is that what we see is that there is not a single country in the world that basically managed to make its immigration relatively popular without being somewhat selective, right? There is no third way, right? There is not a single exception to this rule. Before I conclude, I really want to highlight again that it's not just about prioritizing some kind of skilled migrants over others. Right? I think the most restrictive immigration policy is no immigration, right? So to the extent that we can allow more immigration, make it popular, I think it's always going to be a win, right? And to that end, demonstrably beneficial policies are about policies, not the worth of particular individuals, right? To give you one hypothetical example, right? If we have, let's say, a carpenter from Syria, right? And they have a hypothetical choice between coming to Germany on a work visa and claiming asylum. The work visa route is going to be much more demonstrably beneficial, even though we're talking about the exact same person, right? The problem is that a lot of people don't really have those viable legal pathways to come in many countries. And we also have those positive spillover effects that are important, right? Canada, again, is one of those countries that kind of exemplifies those demonstrably beneficial policies, right? It accepts so many migrants of all kinds. So in a way, it can afford accepting a lot of refugees and asylum seekers too, right? So even again, if you think of immigration primarily in the humanitarian terms, in terms of ensuring public support for continuing immigration, Canada might be a much better bet than Sweden, where now the doors are closed basically. So to kind of wrap up what I've been talking about, right? So for now, we've seen that most countries in the world, they've been like basically oscillating from closed to almost closed borders, from anti-immigration backlash to pro-immigration backlash. So what I show that a lot of the source of this politics that we see and the widespread opposition to immigration is actually conditional, not categorical. And in fact, many people should be willing to accept more immigration under better policies that they can see are good for them. So, to break this catch-22, this vicious cycle where, we have people who don't trust their government on managing immigration and governments don't do anything because they reasonably fear public backlash, somebody has to make the first move. And I'm basically showing that it has to be governments in power, implementing those demonstrably beneficial policies. It's always going to be an uphill battle to make immigration popular. Again, people will always have their biases and populists will always try to exploit them. But in the end of the day, without actually making the policy better, it's not going to happen, right? And so my hope for the book is that to kind of start this conversation and shift it a little bit from, again, trying to come up with just better messaging for a lot of folks, to actually think about better policies that more people are going to be willing to accept for the benefit of all. As I mentioned to some of you, I'm actually right now in conversations with some folks for creating a new migration institute. So, those demonstrably beneficial policies, they're not just in the eyes of the beholder. I think we can measure those in public opinion surveys. And so I'm really interested in working with various stakeholders in various countries to figure out what those policies really mean in different contexts. I'm specifically actually interested in those new migrant destinations like Poland and Japan, where we went from almost zero immigration to some immigration. So I'm really looking forward to talking to all of you here and figuring out how to make immigration popular until it's too late. Thank you.